All right, we're going. Okay, so today we're introducing the concept of wisdom, and I want to begin by placing it in the context of the general theory of moral competence that we are presenting. Right? So, to review, we began with the moral emotions. I find that this is a very good way to start a class on ethics because almost everyone has moral emotions. Statistically speaking, I've now taught enough people that one of my students at some point has been a psychopath, right? But I don't know who that is. I've taught enough students that statistically there's one out there. But for the most part, almost all of you have this normal set of moral emotions. And this is an end to morality because this means that we all feel the initial pull of morality, the desire to behave morally. But what we saw with the moral emotions is that they are conflicting, they are imprecise, they can be misled. Right? We saw that in the IKEA lamp ad video where you were made to feel sympathy for a lamp. So we learn to train our emotions. We learn to control our emotions through strength and willpower. Right? We learn to hold off desire. We learn to restrain our anger, that sort of thing. Once you have emotions under control, over the long term, you have a disposition, you have a character trait that we call a virtue. And we saw in the last section that most virtues seem to be a mean between two extremes. Right? You're supposed to find, at least according to Aristotle, a middle ground. Learn to be angry the right amount of the right things, for instance. But this leads to a problem, a standing problem. Where is that middle ground? I can't remember if in one of the previous classes I mentioned one of my favorite George Carlin sketches, where he talks about driving. Yeah, right? There are two kinds of drivers in the world. The ones who drive faster than you are assholes, and the ones who drive slower than you are morons, right? And we tend to think this way about the virtues too. Anyone who is angrier than we are is a hothead, and anyone who is less angry than we are is insensitive. Well, we can do better than that. We can learn how our emotions should be directed. And so this is where wisdom and knowledge come in. Wisdom and knowledge provide us with direction. That is, it's not enough to simply have this kind of character. You need to have some sense of what the character is for, how it is directed. And this is where we really begin to see the content of morality as it's traditionally studied. Right? So, what is wisdom? Essentially, wisdom is the ability to consistently make good moral decisions. That's the way we're going to be using the word in this course. It is equivalent to a Greek term called phronesis, or practical wisdom. That is, it's not a matter of theoretical, abstract knowledge. It's a working knowledge. It's an ability to do the right thing in real situations. It's cognitive. It's not just an instinct. It involves understanding, but it's a practical and imprecise understanding. So here are some bits from your textbook. The opening of the chapter
Lischka says, whereas moral sentiment creates a desire for the good and moral strength the power to do it, and virtue infuses our character with habits that enable us to continue to do the right thing, wisdom is concerned with envisioning the good life and how best to achieve it. So I said that wisdom provides a direction for your virtues. It helps you identify where that middle ground is. And one thing that we'll see right away is that this means that you need to have a vision. It's the word Lischka uses here, a vision of the good life and how to achieve it. Knowing where the middle ground is means knowing what a good life should look like, approximately. After discussing Aristotle, Lischka goes on and identifies wisdom with Aristotle's phronesis. He says, for our purposes, the term wisdom will refer to practical wisdom. And then finally, in the glossary of the text, he says, wisdom is the ability to consistently choose morally correct actions, to have deliberative talent, discernment, judgment, and savoir-faire. Now, you may think, well, gosh, if wisdom is the ability to consistently choose good moral actions, isn't wisdom all of moral competence, right? I mean, if you're consistently choosing good moral actions, aren't you morally competent? And I think there's something to that, to the extent that were I writing this textbook, I might switch the roles of wisdom and knowledge. That is, put wisdom last as the capstone to everything. Lischka decided to put knowledge last. I've got some theories about why he did that. Mostly because it's the hardest to be sure exists. When we get to the knowledge section, people are going to start asking questions like, is this possible? It's the exact opposite of the emotion section, where you immediately feel that there are moral emotions. Whether moral knowledge exists is quite a different subject. In any case, although you can think of wisdom as the capstone, because it is the thing that leads you to morally correct actions, it is different than moral knowledge, which we will see in Chapter 5. And I will argue in Chapter 5 that knowledge is also necessary for moral competence. Okay. So, this slide again reiterates what I was saying before. It sets up the relationship between wisdom and the previous chapters. Moral emotions, self-control, and virtues are not enough to consistently make good moral decisions. That is, the elements we've seen so far are not sufficient for moral competence. The virtues are ways we use our self-control to handle an emotion towards some good, but we need a direction. Right here, right? Emotion, self-control plus a direction equals virtue. But how do we know we have the right direction? The direction for virtue comes from wisdom and knowledge. I've already said that wisdom is practical and imprecise. I think we can talk in more detail about what that comes down to. Wisdom comes, according to Lischka, from experience. And this experience might be mediated by a mentor or a guru, but ultimately to have understanding of practical situations, you have to have been in practical situations.
And that would be like experience?
Yes. Which is different than knowledge, which is taught in books and classrooms. In the first section, in the very introduction to this course, we talked about two traditions in the study of ethics. an ancient, sagacious tradition, and a modern tradition. People remember that? Sometimes it's even on the first test. So hopefully someone remembers it. Anyone? The idea was that the ancient tradition is seen everywhere. People, whenever, in every culture, confront the problems of ethics and develop wisdom traditions to deal with it. So the sagacious traditions exist in all kinds of places, and they focus on practical wisdom. What we see in modern societies is more of a shift from wisdom to knowledge. And this comes specifically after the scientific revolution. So there's a link back up here with the idea of books in classrooms. Yeah?
So, this may be a stupid statement, but wouldn't it be fair to say that a lot of the Confucian and all those...
Yes. The classical Chinese traditions are definitely wisdom traditions, as is classic Hebrew literature, a lot of classical Greek and Roman literature. But yeah, there's a strong link between some of the classic Chinese traditions and wisdom because they emphasize so much the contextuality of thinking. Confucius, at one point, is confronted because he seems to be giving inconsistent answers. He says to do one thing to one person and another thing to another person. And he says, well, I give the answer based on what the student needs. Right? And so I advise this student this way because of the student. That again emphasizes this context-bound practical thing, and that's characteristic of wisdom in general, and it is especially emphasized in the indigenous Chinese traditions like Taoism and Confucianism. All right. So in any case, what we then see in the modern world, though, is a change in the image of education, actually. Right? In the wisdom tradition, education means assigning yourself to a guru, being assigned to a guru or a mentor, right? Having some sort of apprenticeship relationship. These days, education is systematized in classrooms, right? And so, the image of understanding that comes with the modern colleges and universities and books and classrooms is all bound up with knowledge. And that's all the stuff we'll be dealing with in Chapter 5. That's not to say that ancient traditions don't deal with knowledge at all. In fact, the definition of knowledge that I'm going to be working with comes from Plato, an ancient philosopher. Nevertheless, there's been a grand shift in the emphasis in the study of morality from wisdom to knowledge, starting, I would say, I'm not the first to say this, but I am agreeing with those who say that there's a shift starting around the scientific revolution. Okay. So here's the deal, though. Wisdom comes from experience, neither in books. It follows pretty quickly that wisdom cannot be taught to the young. You must have had experience. We can give you knowledge in classrooms, and in fact, as society has progressed, we are pumping more and more knowledge into children at younger and younger ages. Right? So kindergarten is the new first grade. But that's not about practical wisdom. It's just about knowledge in terms of belief and information. And you wouldn't try to bring wisdom, your own wisdom,
into kindergarten because the young just aren't ready for it. I'm not going to go farther than that, though. Plato says that there's no point in trying to teach anyone wisdom who is under the age of 35. He just says he won't teach philosophy to people under 35. And there's some things were a little bit different back then, but not that different. In America, you vote when you're 18. In ancient Greece, you vote when you're 20. In America, you go to war when you're 18. In ancient Greece, you go to war when you're 20. I have a suspicion, I can't prove this, that actually the 2-year gap there is because of crappy nutrition. That, people weren't big enough to go to war at 18 the way they are now. In any case, that's a strong point.
So then, really, is that a good thing that we are pushing knowledge on our children at a younger age? Is that a good thing? Because I have to question that as a preschool teacher because they lack the maturity and they lack the practical life experience to work with that.
Well, one thing I was told was that although maturity and practical experience is necessary for wisdom, it's not necessary for knowledge.
That's true to an extent, but I think to use it to its fullest extent, I think it is needed. I think maturity and life experience.
Right, but I mean, in the preschool age, the children are just learning very basic knowledge.
Well,
and they're cognitive, where they're learning at the age of 2. I believe it's 2 to 3, they recognize gender difference, and then around the age of 3, they come to recognize the right and the wrong. Well, if I do this to my friend, I'm going to hurt their feelings. I'm going to do this. I have a 4 and a 5-year-old, and I've been in preschool as now a teacher that I help them too. So they're at different stages of developing their knowledge. It doesn't necessarily be wisdom, because I believe from experience, at the time when you're 18, from the time to you're 25, you think totally different about life. So the time you shall be 30 in October, and the way I think now from when I was 25 is totally different.
Well, I'm not saying that you're wrong. What I'm saying is I'm not just focusing on preschool. I'm saying even 18, because they don't have life experiences in general to apply it to.
18 is still very young age.
That's what I'm saying.
You don't know anything at 18.
Well, that's what I'm
know
saying.
what you know.
That's what I'm
So,
saying.
does anyone else want to get pushback here? Because it was actually the 18 thing that was I thought was most relevant to this course rather than the preschool thing. Because that is first of all, that is the level of both knowledge and wisdom that we try to impart here. And also because it's the age that a lot of you are. Go ahead.
But I feel like, with the whole wisdom thing, it depends on where you grew up at, who is in your life, because I've experienced all these things that you can do. I was in a single parent. I think it just depends on how you're raised, where you're raised at, because some people get more wisdom at 18 than other people do. So, and that's the same with kids. Kids see things that most adults haven't seen their entire life, and they pick up on those things. Kids know. Like when I was starting to go, I knew it was wrong. Like my mom and dad was on here. Some kids don't understand. So it just depends on who's around you, or you pick up those experiences in your life.
Really, the root isn't age, it's experience. As the saying goes, it's not the years, it's the mileage. But what kind of experience is important here? Now, one thing that happens a lot is people immediately go to difficult experiences.
I think it's traveling outside your normal comfort.
Can you be more specific and explain how that relates to this?
I think that people that tend to stay within your own realm of comfort. Everything's safe and consistent, and it's what they know. And most people don't like change. And I think that your views are very consistent. I think that, let's say, if you move to another state and you experience another state and you see how other people have different views, and maybe they have different goals for some socioeconomic levels. And I lived in Alaska, and my view was very different after I left Alaska.
Let's go ahead and let me try and get some of these on the screen. Continue recording. Because I like this idea. What kinds of experience bring wisdom? So that's the question. I want to go ahead and start listing them. So the first thing that was actually suggested was single motherhood. What kinds of experience bring wisdom? Single motherhood. And changing location, I want to do something more than location here. Experiencing different places. I guess that sounds better, even though it means the same thing. Experiencing different places. Yeah.
Stepping out of your social limit.
But experiencing. Thank you. Different places or cultures. Okay. Anything else?
What about just parenthood, like becoming a parent, like childbirth?
Single motherhood, parenthood in general.
Your upbringing.
Yeah, I mean, like your whole life changed at that point.
Your whole upbringing.
Like single motherhood, that's a specific one, and you want to say, and your only child.
Okay, well then let's talk about this, right? Because these are things that affect your personality, but do they bring wisdom, right? I mean, because if you start saying things like birth order is a classic personality driver of personality, but what are you going to say? That firstborns are more wise? That secondborns are more wise? Yeah, you don't want to do that. Which makes me think that actually birth order isn't something that necessarily drives wisdom, or is the kind of thing that would make you more wise. So are there other thoughts? Yeah.
The way that your parents were,
Mm-hmm.
what did they raise you?
Yeah, well, I think that's what Max was getting at.
I feel like,
I didn't hear.
I feel like the environment would be good.
Yeah, environment.
Like maybe where you grow up, like maybe you grow up in a could be a temple or a Christian environment.
Again, all of these things, I think I may not be being clear about in the question, because the initial motivation was to ask what kinds of experience would give you wisdom earlier, right? But if you just point to general things like environment is practically synonymous with experience now. You're not looking at something that would give you wisdom earlier or later. You're just looking at, experience. Let's try this from a different angle, actually. Rather than looking at what experiences you need, let's look at what else you might need. So here's a question. Is experience sufficient for wisdom? You're shaking your head no. Why not? Some people just don't learn.
Some people might say you need to take the knowledge, but you get the guidelines, combine that with your experience, so you can use the category, combine those.
There's definitely important interaction between knowledge and wisdom. Yeah, so Okay, so we'll go back here. What kinds of experience bring wisdom? What else is needed for wisdom? The ability to learn from mistakes. What is involved with that ability? Why do some people learn from mistakes and other people don't? Consequences? But actually the thing about driving into the brick wall indicates that some people don't learn from consequences. Stubbornness? I think that's key right there, to the ability to admit. The ability to learn from mistakes involves, first and foremost, admitting that you made a mistake. Right? Above all else is humility. One thing that you might say that humility comes with wisdom, but you also need some humility to begin with to even acquire wisdom. Because otherwise you just won't ever be learning mistakes.
Yeah. What are emotions? Is that a lot of things that go well?
Yeah. One of the things that I suggested early on was that wisdom is still ultimately about emotion because of the tie to virtue. Right? Virtue is about guiding and channeling emotion. Wisdom is about knowing where to guide and channel it. So that means that we're still dealing with emotional decision making here. One of the assumptions, I think, underlying this text, which is a good assumption in my opinion, is that real moral competence, real moral decision making is more or less constantly emotional. It's not a sequence of abstract choices that you calculate and go through. Okay? Now, when we get to the knowledge section, we will be dealing with more traditional abstract philosophy, which is rational and relatively free of emotion. But we're not there. So, wisdom comes from experience in those with the capacity to learn from experience. This means that for the most part, we're still going to wisdom will be associated with older people. That's not to say that all old people are wise. Lord knows they're not. I think everyone can point to an elderly racist relative in the family, just for starters. Lord knows I do. People grow up in a certain environment, and my mother just sort of instructed my grandparents just to not talk about certain things in front of me. And at the same time, it's possible for people to be fairly wise at a young age. The immediate suggestion that came up was that if you had experienced a lot at a young age, you might be more likely to be wise. I'm more inclined to think that it's not actually the amount of experience, or even particularly what you experience, but whether you learn from it. So again, people often point to early hardship as something that drives wisdom. But like anything else, it can only create wisdom if you learn from it.
So you're saying that the ability to learn from mistakes that's not what really trained us from experiencing. I was kind of confused. I was trying to figure out.
We're definitely dealing here with self-reinforcing cycles, right? So that we'll just focus on humility. Humility allows you to learn from mistakes. Learning from mistakes, in turn, might make you more humble, right? We would call these virtuous cycles.
For those important things that you have to learn those.
The important stuff, let's go back to our walk.
I mean, I know there are probably various views to say.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I try not to focus on my own opinions here. But I think there's some things that we can be fairly confident about. Let's go back to the moral competence diagram. The earlier we are on the circle, I think the more it makes sense to talk about innate components. Right? We go back to emotion. Mencius says that everyone is born with a heart that cannot stand to see the suffering of others. Right? And so the emotions seem to have a clearly strong inborn component. Furthermore, breakdowns of the moral emotions themselves seem to have genetic components. This is true of psychopathy. It's also true of other problems with relating to people emotionally that we don't think of as necessarily morally incompetent, but are definitely barriers like autism. Right? You can also talk about, to some degree, about your strength, your willpower, as something that has genetic components, or at least is influenced a lot by early experience and tends to be fixed early on. But as we go around the circle, we find that the traits that we're looking at emerge later in life and are more determined by other environmental factors, right? That are determined by everything that comes after comes with all that additional experience. So are there other thoughts about how one acquires wisdom? Well, some more differences between wisdom and knowledge are important to highlight here. When we attempt to convey wisdom, because wisdom is imprecise, we do not use theories the way we will with knowledge. When we get to the knowledge section, there will be theories of morality. And this is the theories of morality is actually the typical topic of a typical ethics course, right? This is a theory of the good, outlined sort of the same way you might have a theory of gravity. And there's a lot to that. But it doesn't have much to do with the way that people make moral decisions in ordinary life. Moral decisions in ordinary life are not guided so much by theories as they are by metaphors, stories, proverbs, and examples. None of these are meant to be substitutes for experience, but they do work as shorthand for experience. Metaphor, stories, proverbs, examples are ways that we manage to encapsulate the experience that we have and use it to guide ourselves in the future. So in this section, we're going to be spending a lot of time actually talking about proverbs and stories and more humanistic fuzzy stuff. Another thing that happens in the knowledge tradition is because you're looking at theories, These are theories that strive to be universal. In wisdom, there isn't nearly that effort to be universal. Wisdom is very much, because it's practical, it's also bound to culture. So one thing that can make your practical wisdom useless is actually a change in culture. This gets back to your elderly racist relative, right? Your elderly racist relative acquired wisdom that worked in the culture that they lived in. One in which some people were on top and other people were not. As we strive to be a more egalitarian culture, what previously was wisdom ceases to work. I think this is worth emphasizing too, especially if you are, if you think that hard experience or difficult experience is particularly good for driving, for creating wisdom. Because often difficult experience means being in an environment that is different, harsher than other sorts of environments. So, for instance, going to war is one example. There are many skills you learn in the Army, not just like technical skills like fixing jeeps, but interpersonal skills that carry over. There are many that do not, right? And so part of the adjustment to civilian life, as I understand it, involves undoing certain things that counted as wise in combat that don't count as wise in the civilian world. So, wisdom, bound to culture, knowledge, will strive to be universal. And again, this also gets back to the idea that it's a question of whether it is possible. The idea of universal morality is immediately scares something for it.
You think maybe life after you experience it, you live it? You know, like maybe being in a car accident, losing a loved one.
If you have the humility and if you have the ability to learn from it. I mentioned humility, but what else do you think we need to learn from experience?
Acceptance is so important.
Okay, what do you mean by acceptance?
Well, pretty much reiterating what you were saying for a minute, admitting what happened.
Yeah.
Never really admitting that, okay, this is what happened, what can I take out of it? I'm sure we take knowledge from this, at least when I've always been at our time with each other. I don't think we can have one without the other.
Everything we're going to be dealing with is acceptance.
Yeah.
Acceptance.
Because you don't have to look anything. Sometimes things happen you least expect it.
Perception might be another way. It's not just the ability to accept what happened or to acknowledge that you made a mistake, but to even know what happened, right? To be alert to what is actually going on. What caused Okay. A final contrast between wisdom and knowledge is this practical business. And this is another distinction that goes back to Aristotle. Practical wisdom is about what I should do, ultimately. The proof of wisdom is in action. Theoretical knowledge, Aristotle said theoretical wisdom, we'll call it the knowledge tradition, isn't about action, it's about belief. And so one of the things that I'm going to argue in the knowledge section for why knowledge is necessary for moral competence is that I think belief is necessary. moral action depends in some way on moral belief.
But right now we're not there. Right now we're just looking at the practical wisdom, and action ultimately. Okay, so you can think of this. We've got our different elements of moral competence. Emotion and sentiment were generated by genetics and early childhood experience. Autonomy and self-control are developed by, and this was in the chapter we talked about Klausner's methods of developing your self-control. Emotional methods, Platonic methods, habit, externalization, and all of this actually just plays straight into how you develop the virtue, right, of habit and learning. Wisdom is acquired by experience in those with the virtues to learn from experience. You see how things are intertwined here. You actually need virtue to acquire wisdom, and you need wisdom to have virtue. And if you're building, this will become a cycle of positive reinforcement. And as we'll see in the next chapter, knowledge comes from scientific testing or ethical investigations that work in a similar fashion. All right. Your textbook divides wisdom into 3 components, and I should look this up. I think he's getting this ultimately from Cicero. So there's an org chart. Which way is this org charts? Yeah. So this is read 1, I think. I added some details. Wisdom is the ability to consistently choose morally correct actions. And it's split up into vision, deliberation, and judgment. I think this is from Cicero. And these are related as ends, means, and execution. So the first thing you need is a sense of what the good is. If you are to find a balance in, for instance, the amount of anger you feel, you need to have a vision of what a good person is like. Now, the word vision here is chosen because we're not dealing with a precise theoretical scientific account of a good person. We're looking more at an image or a story. In this section, we're going to be looking more at stories as things that convey wisdom. These stories, though, aren't just about individuals. They're also about societies and ultimately the universe itself. We need a sense of the moral order of the universe and our place in it. And different kinds of stories will give us very different understandings of the moral order of the universe and our place in it. There's a heavy emphasis here on creation stories, really at every level. We have myths we tell about the creation of the universe. The Genesis story is one such myth. Let's also look at a nice story from the Tlinkits, Native Alaskan ethnic group near where he lives up in Alaska, about how Raven creates the world. And it's interesting, Raven is a very different kind of creator god than Jehovah. And you get a different contrast there. So the creation story can tell us about the origin of the universe, about the moral order of the universe. We can also talk about creation stories for societies. In the Enlightenment, there were a lot of social contract theorists, people like Locke and Hobbes, who imagined how it is that society came about from the state of nature, right? How we were before we lived in society and how we live afterwards.
And these weren't intended as literal histories. They are essentially creation myths. They are creation myths for society in general that explain the moral order of society. Individual nations also have creation myths, right? America has creation stories based around things like the American Revolution and the conquest of the West, right? I mean, all those westerns we watch that are essentially retellings of the creation myths of our culture, of our society. The Greeks had something similar. The Athenians believed they were autophonic. Auto meaning self and phonic meaning earth. They thought that Athens just sprung up from the ground. Boom! And that they were all descended of Zeus. These creation stories give you a sense of the origin of the moral order of society. And there are creation stories about individuals. And here, I think the best example is something that's kind of trashy, but it's superhero stories. Superheroes all have origin stories. Okay, what's Spider-Man's origin story? He got bit by a radioactive spider. And what else happened here? Because there's not just there's a moral component to it, right? Or maybe you didn't.
They didn't stop
That's right. There you go. See, I live with a 6-year-old boy, so I know these things. Yes, originally Spider-Man decided he'd be a wrestler, a pro wrestler. He makes the outfit as a wrestling costume, and then he fails to stop a thief, and the thief kills his Uncle Ben, and that's when he realizes that with great power comes great responsibility, and he becomes a superhero. Origins, again, tell us about the moral order of now our character. Okay. So, I've actually already outlined more of this than I realized. Because your vision of the universe, of moral order, comes on several scales. And we're going to look at cosmic scale, a social scale, and an individual scale. Now, one thing that I'm claiming here is that your vision, the moral vision here, is best captured in a story, or particularly an origin story. So one of the things I want to do as an exercise is have you guys think about the stories that you grew up with or are important to you. And we're not going to be able to get to this exercise today. We won't do it next week. But go ahead and start thinking about this. What stories do we tell as a child? And what is the implicit moral structure of that? One thing that your textbook does here that's very interesting is it emphasizes the way that the moral of the story isn't just the overt, Berenstain Bears kind of you should stand up to bullies, or don't smoke, or just say no to drugs. There's a deeper level of the moral of the story that comes from the structure of the story. Yeah.
Are you talking about stories that all of us are going to tell, or stories like humanity or
Both.
Okay.
One common thing is people will say, "Look, I was a Disney princess, and now let's stop and think. What are the messages that Disney is sending about the moral order of the universe?" They're mixed, by the way.
And this would be true of almost everything. Most stories send mixed messages. Disney sends mixed messages in a really, really way. But also, it's sometimes interesting when people say, you know, my grandma, and then they go off on something that I haven't heard of. And it's like, wow. It also helps, especially with people who come from other countries, because they get familiar with other countries. But in any case, the idea is to pick something personal and learn from it. Learn to appreciate what it is actually trying to tell you. Okay, so that is all the stuff about vision. I said though that vision is just one component of wisdom. You need a sense of what the moral order of life is. Once you have that sense, that gives you a sense of end. You need to identify means to ends. And so the section on deliberation is about that. Deliberation is defined here as practical reasoning to find the best moral means to a moral goal. And again, we're going to look at different images for how to deliberate. I used stories as our way of understanding vision. I want to use proverbs as a way of understanding deliberation. You know, proverbs that and then this all comes together in judgment. Practical reasoning that concludes in action. The thing about judgment is that for each element of moral competence, we can think about what it is to lack that element of moral competence. Someone who lacks wisdom manifests that in bad judgment. And once you think about the phrase "bad judgment," I think, at least for me at least, all sorts of people immediately pop into my head. Man, you just used bad judgment there. And so that'll be the concluding section. All right. Okay, so I was going to talk about narrative visions, but I don't think we really have time. We do still have 3 solid minutes of class that I don't want to go to waste. So are there thoughts or questions about wisdom? How many people here would count themselves as wise? Oh, good. After all that lesson on humility, everyone's like, no. Well, maybe a little. Or maybe in some areas. I mean, one thing I said was, wisdom is bound to culture and place. I don't count myself as wise, but I feel like after 15 years of working in colleges and universities, I have a sense of how these institutions work. Right? And so there's a certain practical wisdom that comes from that small area. Right? Yeah. Are you raising your hand? No. You're raising your hand.
Yeah, I have a question about your opinion. Who would you, think of someone who is wise?
I already said I try not to divulge my opinions, but I'm a professional philosopher. Of course, I'm in the Western tradition, so of course, I'm going to say Socrates, right? Actually, it's interesting though. I wrote a dissertation on a guy named Wittgenstein, a 20th century philosopher, and I would describe him as the opposite of wise. I actually think he was a total klutz, sort of interpersonally, but this itself was something that we could learn from. Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
So will we get our grades just on our papers as you grade them?
Yeah.
Through Angel?
Mm-hmm.
And
I grade by topic, so I'm going to do all the shame and guilt papers.
And then what about our text grading?
They will come in after the papers.
Okay.
How are we for time? Oh, I guess I'll let you guys go. Yeah.
Will you be giving a physical copy of the
Yes, I will.
paper with comments we can come up with?
Yes. I'll also be emailing you one. But it won't be physical. It'll have the same comments.